Hello, my name is Willow Hosella, and I'm going to be discussing the research updates regarding autism and autism interventions for this year. The majority of this presentation is going to be aimed at discussing what aspects of research are most important for people who are applying that research with individuals with autism. So if you work in a school, if you work in a home, if you work in a community-based setting and you're working with folks with autism and you're also interacting with research, what I'm hoping to do is provide some ideas for how to read research critically to identify research that will offer some sort of pragmatic, helpful approach for working with the folks you're lucky enough to get to work with. This is Patent's mission statement in our support of the work of the Bureau of Special Education. And this is our statement that the goal of education for students is to start in the general ed setting and move to more restrictive settings based on data, based on assessment, and based on what is going to make sure students are successful in their education. So I'm going to start by discussing a little bit of prevalence data. This is the data that tells us how many people have autism diagnoses in the United States. And in 2018, that number was 1 in 59. In 2012, Roy Richard Grinker appeared at this conference and he discussed some research he'd done on frequency of diagnosis in Korea. He hypothesized that the autism prevalence will probably peak at around 1 in 38 people. If you're interested at all in that session, I've put a link to the archive that can be viewed for free at the Penn State website. It's a very interesting presentation. I encourage you to watch it if this topic is something that you're interested in or find yourself curious about. In 2020, the rate of autism diagnoses in the United States is about 1 in 54 children. These diagnoses occur across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. And the National Institute of Health has reported that autism diagnoses is 4.6 times more common among males than females. This increase in autism diagnoses is also reflected in Pennsylvania's data. You see here the Pennsylvania Department of Education's child count data, which shows the increase in rates of diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder starting in 1993 up to the current year. And you can see that steady incline upward. This data should be telling us that we need to make sure we're supporting folks. We are training teachers, training paraeducators, training parents, helping them learn what they need to do with the students with whom they get to work with so that they can maximize positive outcomes for those students. I'm going to briefly review the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. This is a group of programs set up by the CDC, and what they are looking to do at the Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network is to describe the population of children with autism, compare how common autism is from one area of the country to the other, identify any changes in the occurrence of autism diagnoses over time, and finally to understand the impact of related conditions in United States communities. The Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network has also identified that autism occurs across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. This year was the first year that the network found no overall difference between the number of Black children diagnosed with autism from white children. This is a good thing because it is addressing a disparity that had previously existed and may come back to exist. We need to monitor these types of things. Obviously, as you saw on the previous slide and you see on this one, your racial or ethnic background is not an indicator of whether you will get autism or whether you'll receive a diagnosis of autism. So that disparity really shouldn't probably be there. So this year being the first year that Black children were identified with no difference in rates of diagnoses with white children is a move toward a more equitable diagnosis of autism. There is still, unfortunately, a disparity between Hispanic children and Black and white children. They receive less diagnoses. Once again, because racial and ethnic background is not an indicator, it's unlikely that that is the result of some sort of genetic component, though that might be something that future research identifies. Significant progress has been made toward the Healthy People 2020 goal of increasing the percentage of children with ASD who receive their first evaluation by 36 months of age. This is also a good thing, as many of the folks in the audience who work in education know, earlier intervention is generally better intervention. The sooner you address communicative deficits or whatever it is that needs to be addressed, the better. If you are at all interested in the Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, I've provided a link here to their 2020 community report. This is an overview of the research. It's an overview of the results. It sort of drills down into the data a little bit more, but is fairly readable and fairly open and possible for somebody who's maybe not reading a ton of research to be able to read it and understand. I'd also encourage you, if you do visit that link, to click around on the CDC's website, particularly under the autism category, because there's a lot of other helpful information regarding these trends in data regarding diagnosis. I now want to give a quick update on the SEED, or the Study to Explore Early Development project. This was discussed in 2018 by Mike Miklos during the research updates portion of the conference. And I just wanted to give a little bit of follow-up, because this is the largest study in the United States to look at factors that may put children at risk for autism diagnoses, as well as other developmental disabilities. These are the research goals for SEED. They are looking to describe physical, behavioral characteristics of children with autism. They are doing this by looking at children with autism and other diagnoses, other developmental disabilities, and children without any developmental delay or disability. In looking at these three groups, they're hoping to compare and identify health conditions that may be common among children with and without autism, and perhaps most importantly, detecting those factors that are associated with a child being likely to receive an autism spectrum diagnosis. These next two slides are going to be a couple of selected publications, research publications from the SEED work. I included these because I wanted people to have some idea of what they're looking at. You see the first one here is on pica, autism, and other disabilities, looking at, are children with autism more likely to develop pica? Are children with pica more often have a comorbid disease or comorbid health condition than, say, children from the general population without any developmental disability or diagnosis? The second one is on gastrointestinal symptoms in young children. They were looking at do students who have an autism diagnosis, are they more likely to have gastrointestinal distress or gastrointestinal symptoms that occur more often than that in the general population? And finally, this was on behavioral trends for students with autism. They looked at wandering behavior when students wander off. Is it more common, less common? Is it about equal amongst those three subgroups? And once again, all of this research is available on the SEED website as well. This is a very brief list. I simply selected three research publications that addressed common issues that come up in my personal work with students with autism, and I thought might be of interest to the audience at large. If you would like to look at more research related to these things, please do visit the CDC website under the SEED research. They provide all of these for free. You can simply click on the link and it will take you to the actual publication. You can read over it, that kind of thing. It's very easy to use. And though some of the research publications you'll see in there are written fairly technically, there are overviews and reports and things of that nature if you should find yourself confused and you need a breakdown. Lord knows I've been there. So these types of comparison research, large N studies looking across many years at things like rates of diagnoses, they're extremely valuable for the field. It's information that can be used to address disparities in diagnosis and disparities in intervention. Potential genetic markers is a topic of research that you'll see in both of those projects I discussed. This is wonderful research, and it's very helpful as we move forward in addressing and supporting those with an autism diagnosis. However, there are a lot of people who already have an autism diagnosis, and we need to talk about research a little bit that focuses on how to help and support them now where they're at. These are some examples of research that I've found helpful in working with students. How should I structure a classroom? How do I structure a learning session so that I can make sure that the student does well and likes the session and has enjoyed their time with me while they've also learned to do something different as a result of working with me? What's an appropriate skills sequence? When should I teach someone how to label their prepositions? How to say that the pen is in the cup or something along those lines. Appropriate assessment. Assessment is where all education should start, and an appropriate assessment for people who have communicative deficits is an important topic. Are there curriculums that are supported by research? What are the teaching strategies found in those curriculums or otherwise that are effective for the population we're all lucky enough to work with? And finally, when we make decisions, are we making them based on data? If so, what data? And how do I know when I'm reading research that what I'm reading is good research, or research of a quality that I would be able to implement or use in my classroom or in my home or in the community or wherever I'm working? To that end, the National Autism Center Standards Report has done a meta-analysis of that type of research, the type of research that tells us what can we do to support students with autism that we're working with right now. A meta-analysis is simply when we take data from many different studies. We collect many studies and we look to identify common trends in the results. So if we look at many hundreds of studies on working with students with autism, which ones showed positive results? Which ones were consistent with previous ones? Which ones were replications that showed the same result? Are all things that you want to think about. A meta-analysis is simply taking all that previously conducted research and looking at it for some commonality, for what's going on that's similar across each of the study. The National Autism Center Standards Report is available for free. I've put a link there so that you can access it. The Phase 1 and Phase 2 are completed, and Phase 2 is the one that you'll download if you click on that link. It contains all of the Phase 1 report as well as updates on all the previously reviewed literature, as well as including literature that had been published since Phase 1 had been completed. The National Autism Center Standards Project has also begun Phase 3, and the primary goal of Phase 3 is to provide updated information about which interventions have been shown to be effective. This is an extension of the previous two phases. They're doing the same meta-analysis, looking at a lot of research to identify common trends. It will include all previous research from Phase 1 and 2, as well as any new research conducted through 2018. The report is scheduled to be released this year. It was not available as of this recording. For all I know, it's available right now, this moment. If you are interested at all in the National Autism Center Standards Project, I've also put the link to the homepage of their website, and I highly encourage you to take a look at that, because the National Autism Center Standards Report is a good meta-analysis that provides us with some information about what research seems to indicate is effective for the populations that we're working with. These are some other important meta-analyses: the Missouri Guide to Evidence-Based Intervention, the Maine Intervention for Autism Spectrum Disorders, State of the Evidence, North Carolina's Evidence-Based Practices Report, the New York Report on the recommendations for young children, age 0 to 3, The National Research Council also has Educating Children with Autism. If you Google these, you'll be able to find overviews. I don't know that they're all available for download, but you'll at least be able to see the results of these other meta-analyses looking at previous research to identify commonalities across that research of what is effective for students with autism. Interestingly, all of these meta-analyses do share a commonality in their own results, which is a good thing for meta-analyses because it means that they're probably accurate. If they're all pointing in the same direction, that's a good thing in research. The majority of the established interventions across all of these meta-analyses were research that was developed from behavioral literature, such as applied behavior analysis. What the meta-analyses seem to be indicating is that applied behavior analysis is a good, effective strategy for folks with autism that is supported by a lot of good quality research. This increase in diagnoses that I discussed at the beginning of this session, I hope it's telling everyone in the audience something. It's telling us that we need to make sure that what we're doing is effective, whether we are training people who work with students with autism or whether we're working with students with autism directly or whether we're disseminating information to parents. We want to make sure that as we move forward as practitioners, that we are using evidence-based treatment and that we are maintaining our contact with research. That we are being good stewards of information by reading good research, identifying good research, and then looking for ways to apply that within our own practice. I would highly advocate that services as they are provided, we need to look at things within instructional settings such as school, but we also need to be looking at settings outside of school. So look for research, in this case, for things that show some level of generalization. We'll talk about generalization here in a moment, but are we looking at what works best in a school building, what works best in a home, what works best in the community? Those may be the same thing broadly, or they may be very different, but the only way we're going to know that is through research. The amount of information available to people who are working with students with autism is enormous. There's a huge amount of research of all types of quality, from very excellent double-blind, empirically reviewed studies to stuff I get sent on Facebook. It really runs a gamut. And what I want to do from this point on is to discuss some considerations for when you are interacting with research, whether it's discussing research with a friend and they tell you about some study they heard about on the radio on the way to work, or whether it's sitting down and reading a journal article that you thought would be interesting. What I'm going to be looking to do from this point on is to be speaking to those in the audience who are working either directly with students with autism or who are working with people who do work directly with them, and give some ideas of what you should consider in your critique of any research that you decide to pursue or to interact with, excuse me. This is going to be sort of the broad overview. This is the questions that I'm going to go over each one a little bit in depth to give you some ideas of how you would look at this type of, how you would look at research in a way that you could critique it to identify whether it's applicable for you in your setting or you with your population, or however you are attempting to improve the lives of individuals with autism. Is the research replicable? Are the procedures, is the research written in a way that is technological? Could you follow along and do the same things that you read in the article or you saw in the presentation or you heard about in the podcast or whatever it may be? Is the research applicable? Does it address something that needs to be addressed, that's important to society, important to the individuals with whom we work? Does the research include generalization? If I teach a student how to do something in a classroom using a specific method from research, are they then able to do that same thing in another setting or with another person or at a different time? Does the research provide a coherent analysis? Can the research explain the results in a way that holds water? Is it legitimate, the analysis that is being purported? And finally, are the variables that are described in the research described in a way that is observable and measurable? What I'll do now is go over each of these points and discuss how they apply to good research that you can use in your practice with students with autism. The first is replicability. Replicability is simply that somebody reads some research and then they do the same type of research and they get similar results. This is a critical aspect of all research, not just research with individuals with autism. Any scientific endeavor should include some level of replicability if it's to be called research. If something is not replicable, if the way the experiment or the procedure or whatever it is set up and somebody else couldn't reasonably do it, then you won't really know for sure that what was done in the research is the reason for the change that is being reported. It's also important to note that just because something is replicable, just because another group of researchers can do that research and they can do it in the same way and maybe they'll get the same results, just because it is replicable, it also has to be replicated. Simply being replicable isn't enough. We want to make sure that the replication takes place so that we have some verification that what happened in the anchor study or the first study, the results of that continue to happen when you do the same thing with similar populations. If anybody is interested in this topic specific to applied behavior analysis, I've included a couple of citations here, and you can look at the references at the end of my slide. These are discussions about replicability in applied behavior analysis and the necessity of behavior analysts replicating work. This is a quote from Alexis Carrel. I believe he won a Nobel Prize for his work on vascular surgery. And he was an individual that I presume knew some research. Anytime you're winning awards for your vascular surgery, I'm assuming you're pretty empirical in your approach. But he said, a few observations and much reasoning leads to error. Many observations and a little reasoning leads to truth. I love this quote, and I included it because it really does get to the heart of science and good research. If you only see somebody do something a few times and then you try and figure out why they did it, you try and rationalize and you put your own opinions or whatever it might be, and you come up with a cause for why they did what they did, that might just be your interpretation. What you really want to see is a lot of observations under the same conditions, and then use the principle of parsimony, which means that most often the simplest explanation is the best explanation. The next aspect of research I want to discuss is the idea of technological description. A technological description is simply that the published research is written in a way that somebody else could do it, that somebody else could follow the same steps that those previous researchers had followed, and they would get similar results. Good technological writing, if you want a good example of it, look for a well-written recipe. Or think about your cousin that can give great driving directions around the city of Philadelphia or something like that. It's where you have procedural steps which you can follow, even though you may never have done this before, or done whatever it is that you're doing, but you can follow those steps and obtain the same results. That's technological description. We want to be able, when we interact with research, we want it to be described in a way that we could reasonably do it ourselves, were we to have the available technology or available resources or whatever you might need. Is the research written in a way that you would know what to do if you needed to replicate it? Notice that replication can only occur if when you read the research, you understand what on earth they did, so you could go out and do it on your own. Good technological writing also has implications for those of us working in the applied field. If research is written in a way that you don't know what the researcher did, it's going to be really difficult for you to replicate that in the classroom or in a home in a pragmatic way. You're going to really struggle. You want to look for research that after you've read it, you understand what happened, you understand what the researcher did, and you could set it up somewhere in a classroom, in a home, or wherever you work. That is the benefit of good technological writing. Once again, think of a recipe, a well-written recipe. Anybody should be able to make whatever the food is that's being made in the recipe. Here's some aspects of good technological writing or good technological descriptions. Does it say explicitly what the researcher did? Does it say what the participants did as a result of what the researchers did? What was measured? How was it measured? Did they take a frequency count? Did they time how long something occurred for? What were those variables and how did they measure them? What was the inclusion criteria? What was the population characteristics? If I publish research on some teaching methods that I did with a number of students in a preschool classroom, that might not be as applicable to a student who's 21 about to transition out of formal public education. It may also be applicable in that circumstance. It depends on the research, of course, but without that information, anybody attempting to use what they've read in research, it's going to be at a little bit of a deficit. They might struggle a little bit because the description wasn't adequate to tell the person not just what to do and how to do it, but with whom to do it, when to do it, all of those types of considerations. The next consideration that I would highly recommend, and I think this is something most people intuitively sort of drift toward when they're reading research, is the research applicable? Application means that the research is looking at socially significant issues, and socially significant simply in the case of teaching methods and things like that, it's behavior that you're going to teach that will improve a person's life or lead to greater independence. And I'll have some examples of socially significant research toward the end, but just think when you read it, is this addressing a problem that I'm running into in my practice or that the person I work with is running into in their day-to-day life? If so, it's likely applicable. Application is important because this is the purpose of science, to improve the lives of people. And part of our critique of research should always be, is what I'm reading of some value to those with whom I'm working? So here's an example of some research that I think, given this past year, is socially significant. Teaching students with autism to tolerate wearing a face mask, something that I know many teachers with whom I'm lucky enough to work have struggled with. It's a significant issue. As I'm a parent of 2 children, and my children don't have an autism diagnosis or anything like that, but I had to teach them to remember their mask. We couldn't go to the grocery store for a long time without one. So this is a socially significant issue at the time the research was being conducted. And a very nice bonus to this research is that it's not just applicable, it is an extension and a replication of previous research for teaching people with autism to tolerate medical routines. So they have taken previous research, replicated it, and what they changed was, rather than say wearing your glasses or tolerating being in an MRI setup where you have to get an MRI or an X-ray or whatever the medical routines that had previously been taught, they took those same methods and applied it to teaching people with autism to wear and tolerate a face mask. If the interventions that we are developing from research are going to be socially valid, that means we have to make sure that significant, meaningful change to the students with whom we work, for their behavior, maintains over time, that it generalizes to natural environment conditions, that it leads to generative responding. Generative responding is just that I learn to respond to the right way under novel circumstances. I'm taught how to ask for a glass of water from my teacher. I should also be able to ask for a glass of water from the waiter when he asks, would you like anything to drink? That's an example of generalization. Generalization is a part of application, and that's our next topic. Does the research provide any evidence that what happened in the experimental condition happens in other conditions? If the participant learned to do something, was there any attempt to see that the skill maintained over time? If you did some research on math problem solving, you would find that my math skills have not maintained well over time. And that might require, if I were to be working in a field that relied heavily on mathematics, I might need an intervention of some kind to reteach or to sort of remind me of what I should be doing. Very importantly, is the generalization including aspects of natural conditions, that I've learned to do something in a classroom, or I've learned to do something with my speech and language pathologist. Can I do that with other people, with other educators, with other family members, whoever it might be? Some ways to assess generalization can be across people. I've been taught how to ask for a glass of water from my teacher. Do I ask other people for water when I'm thirsty? Across other environments, materials, time. Does the skill maintain, as I mentioned, across time in a way that's going to be significant for the student? Here's an example of generalization across people. This young man was was a student in a classroom where where the Patent Autism Initiative consults, and he had been taught to ask for information. He'd been taught to ask who has the X, the Y, or whatever it is. You'll see here he's going to ask who has my headphones. However, only his teacher had taught him to ask for this information, and we wanted to make sure that he would ask other people for information under the same conditions. And you'll see us run a little trial here to see how that worked out. Kyrin, I need you to take your headphones to Art. Oh, you don't have them? I don't have them, but I know who does. Oh, where are you going? I know who has them. Oh, my friend Laura has them.
It's Laura.
Yeah.
You got my headphones?
I do have your headphones here. Go for it.
What we found was that he had not learned to ask for information from other people. So what we did is we changed what we were doing a bit to make sure that we set up lots of opportunities for him to ask other people for information other than his teacher. It's a very basic example, but it's a very important one, because if he had only learned to ask for information from his teacher's not the only person that he's going to have to ask information from. He's going to have to ask his boss for information. Where's the milk? Things like that. And that was a way that we checked for generalization, identified that it had not occurred, and went back and retaught it so that it did occur over time. And I'm very happy to say that it did indeed generalize. He's graduated now and he's employed. But this is an example of someone who, if we had simply looked at the research and not checked for generalization, if we'd only followed the procedures as if we were conducting the research, but we hadn't then checked for generalization, we hadn't then gone out and ran it in the natural conditions, he might have been graduating school with a bit of a deficit that's pretty significant as far as communicating with your peers and with others. And that now brings us to the analysis. Does the research explain why the results can be reasonably connected to what the researchers did? A quality analysis should be consistent with previous research, with the concepts and principles of the established science, whatever the research may be. This doesn't just apply to research with people with autism. When the explanation for what is being reported is provided, is it coherent with previous research and established principles? They're not invoking new principles. They're not claiming some new phenomenon without proving it. This analysis, looking for a quality analysis, is very important, because there are times when things can appear to cause something to happen, but they're not the cause. It's just correlation. They just happened to occur at the same time or with similar results, but they don't actually influence each other. This is an example of something that looks like it's very much causal. It looks like those two things are correlated at 96%. That's a really, really close correlation. But The two lines you see there, the green one is the amount of mozzarella cheese bought in the United States, and the red one is the number of doctoral civil engineers graduated across those years. It would be pretty crazy to propose that we can improve our infrastructure by increasing the number of civil engineers with high qualifications, and the best way to do that would be double cheese on your pizza. That's not a causal relation, but these types of things, this is sort of a humorous example, but they can happen in research where we think something occurred because of what we did, but it could be something very much removed from what we did. Once again, the way to address this is replication, a coherent analysis, and the only way that that replication can occur is with the technological writing I discussed earlier. A coherent analysis will not invoke principles that have not been verified by previous research. If you are reading research and it's saying that the reason for this is a principle that has not yet been established, I would read that with a grain or perhaps boulder of salt. I would really be very skeptical of that kind of research. A useful analysis explains why what was measured changed as a result of what was done. This type of critique is very important for research, and if I'm to speak from my own personal experience, it's one of the more difficult aspects of critiquing research. It requires you to be familiar with other research. It requires you to be familiar with the concepts and principles of whatever scientific data you're reading. But with all that said, it is critical that we are talking about why the change occurred in the research that you're reading was related to or was caused by what the researcher did. And that's where your analysis should kick in. The analysis should also take into account other variables that may influence the results. They should be looking at other flaws or perhaps weaknesses in their own research. Good research should be upfront about that. We only had 3 participants, so this is small n, and we need more participants. We need more replication in the future. Those types of statements aren't statements of what somebody did wrong. They're statements of what future people can do right when they replicate the research. Hank Schlinger, this is a quote from an article on analysis, which I would highly recommend, Schlinger 2017, it's in the references. Newton predicted the gravitational effects of the moon on ocean tides without controlling them. That's true. Nobody's ever moved the moon around to make sure that what we describe as the tidal forces occur because of the change in the relation of the moon to the Earth. He took simpler experiments where he could control the variables. And once he had done those experiments, he used the analysis to propose why the tides move as they do. And with our current level of technology, our current level of data, and what we know in science, he was pretty close. He did a nice job with that. And the way he did that was taking good experiments where he had good, tight control, getting results that he could analyze, and then hypothesizing how the moon affects the change in tide. Does the research describe what the researcher did and what the participant did in a way that is observable and measurable? This is critical for research. If we are invoking things that nobody can see, if I'm saying that the reason a student is having problem behavior is because of something that is going on that I cannot possibly see or observe, that's going to be a problem. And research is very similar in that when we talk about why something occurred, when we read research that says we did X and as a result the participants did Y, the X and the Y need to be observable and measurable. We want that if I said that I was doing some research and I described what I was doing and somebody came in and watched me do it, they would agree with other people who had watched me, yes, he did X and the student did Y. I highly encourage you to be very skeptical of self-report as a variable. We are, as humans, notoriously bad at self-reporting. There's myriad examples. If you ask most people, Are you a good driver? I mean, are you a good driver, like your kids are safe in the car with you, other people on the road are reasonably safe? Most people will say yes. Most rational people will say, yeah, I'm a pretty safe driver. But anyone who drives on the turnpike might have a different opinion on how frequent good driving occurs. Self-report is not adequate to explain why something happened. Self-report can be a very valuable part of research. We can identify if the people who participated in the research thought it was a valuable experience or good experience. There are places and times for self-report, but self-report should not be the variable, the only variable that is measured, or the only way we explain what has occurred in the research that we're describing or analyzing. I wanted to offer some current research that has some wonderful examples of observable and measurable variables. This is emergent completion of multi-step instruction via joint control. This was published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 2020. The two authors, Vosters and Lusinski, what did they do as experimenters? And the answer is that they taught the participants to rehearse out loud, follow multiple step instructions. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a table from that research, and what you're seeing is a good example of technological writing and observable, measurable variables. It's explicit, it says what the researcher did, and then they describe what the participants did. So what did the participants do as a result of their being taught these procedures? They followed multiple step instructions, including novel instructions not taught directly. I included the graph in there just as an example of how you might represent what the participant did. So once again, when you're looking at observable and measurable variables, what you really want to focus on is, did the research describe what the researcher did, what the experimenters did, and did it describe what the participant did? This is a part of technological writing, and that should also include other variables, other descriptions of things that may have gone right or wrong, etc. But at its core, when you think of observable and measurable variables, think about what the researcher did, and then what did the participant do? This is a very good way of analyzing research, because for those of us in the applied field, we are going to be doing something similar to what the researcher did. If the student, in this case, sort of our participants, as it were, if they don't respond in a similar way as the participants in the research responded, then we need to look at that. We need to figure out, is that an error on our end? Did we not replicate the procedures? Going back to that technological writing, did we miss a step? Did we not understand what we were doing? This is valuable for those conducting research, and this is valuable for those of us working directly with students with autism to know what we should do and what we should expect the students we're working with to do as a result of what we've done. So I want to give a brief critique of that Vosters and Lusinski study, because it has all of the elements we've talked about and shows nice examples of them. So Vosters and Lusinski 2020 used previous research to address a socially significant issue for people with autism. All of the participants in that research were unable to follow multiple step instructions prior to the intervention described in the research, and after the research, they were able to. It's socially significant because following multiple step instructions happens all the time. It is ubiquitous in our society. If you visit a general education kindergarten class, you'll hear kids being told to do all sorts of things. Put your books away, go get a hat from the cubby, and then line up in order. Everybody come over to the book area, sit crisscross applesauce, and we're gonna watch a movie. Those are multiple step instructions. Your boss gives you multiple step instructions. I need you to complete the report, email it to your supervisor, and then CC me. Multiple step instruction. Because it's socially significant, it meets that criteria. It's a replication of previous research. So it's replicable if it's a replication, I hope, because it means that they were able to do what the previous studies had done. And now they're offering some variation in those procedures for others to replicate and extend, hopefully. They describe their methods explicitly, technological writing, and they offer an analysis of their results that is completely consistent with previous literature, with previous research, and the conceptual analysis does not invoke new principles, doesn't claim to have found some Rosetta Stone of teaching students to follow multiple step instructions. It sticks to the concepts and principles of the science in which this work was done, applied behavior analysis. The variables in the research were observable and measurable. What were those variables? Teaching students to rehearse aloud, correctly following multiple step direction. Those are variables that are described explicitly. Anybody who reads that study might well be able to follow those procedures the next day in their classroom. I'm not recommending you do that. You don't just pick up research and attempt to intervene on someone. There's other considerations that one should absolutely make. Vosters and Lusinski looked for generalization by asking the participants to engage in the multiple step instructions, but with novel examples. They did not explicitly teach some of the multiple step directions that they asked the participants to follow. And what they saw was that the students did it. They were able to do the multiple step instructions, accurately follow them in the home setting, in other settings. That's a really good example of generalization, because if I can follow multiple step instructions at the clinic where the research is done, but I can't follow multiple step instructions when my mom or dad tells me, get your shoes, your coat, and your hat and meet me at the door, then it's really not as applicable as we thought. We need to make sure that that generalization is occurring, because that's part of that social significance. The considerations that I've discussed here are not exhaustive. They're a good starting point. This is sort of a basic skepticism when reading research type of approach. But I know that within my field, within the field of education, there are people who are very interested in research. They're reading it all the time and they're really engaged with it. There are people who don't have the time or the ability to maybe engage with research. And for those people, it might be helpful for us, those of us who do read the research, do interact with it, to be able to explain to people not just why the research is important for their practice, but why it's of a quality that indicates it's worth implementing with the students that we all work with. It's also important to remember that good quality research might have some, but not all of the criteria that I've talked about here. There are examples of research that meet some of these, but not all of these. We might do a survey on what teachers report doing most often to inform future research, to change those procedures, to refine them, to confirm that they work very well. The variables in that type of research are a survey. It's self-report. It's not really the best thing to do, but it's a pragmatic way to find out what people are doing, and it can guide other future research. So that may well be a very good example of research, this type of survey, provided that it then encourages or causes people to go out and look into the topic a little bit more and conduct more rigorous research. You might do research that shows great results. It shows great results, but you were only able to do it in a single classroom. That's okay. That's, you know, they might not show causation. It might not say 100% this teaching procedure is why these students learn this, but that's okay because replication can address that. When certain elements that I've discussed in this presentation are perhaps missing from research, that may be okay because that might just be the starting point. Or it may be that they've gone in another direction. They're looking at refining a specific component. As an overview though, these points, these topics I've mentioned are a great way to get yourself ready to read or interact with research. They're great questions to pose to people who are saying, well, this is research-based or this is evidence-based. Take a look at the research, take a look at the evidence and see if it meets these kinds of criteria. If not, you might need to look for more research, or you might need to say, well, this isn't quite quite what I was looking for. I think we need to see some more research in this direction before I'm willing to adopt it as a practice in my classroom or in my home or with my clients or with my child or wherever it might be. The focus of this presentation was on research for those of us who are lucky enough to get to work with students with autism. This has become my life's work. I love it. I'm passionate about it. I needed something like this when I started out in the field, and that's sort of why I put some of this together. It is important, though, to remember that there's many different types of research: descriptive, statistical, exploratory. Those different research goals may require different analyses of the research methods. What I'm saying here is that I'm speaking to you as a practitioner, as somebody in the applied setting who uses research to guide my own practice, but I might need a slightly different set of skills if I were engaged in some other practice. If I were digging oil wells or working to change cultural beliefs or something along those lines, there are probably other considerations. This is specifically for those of us working with students with autism in applied settings who are relying on research and relying on evidence to guide what we do so we're most effective with our students. I'm going to end this session with a quote. This is from the foreword from The Technology of Teaching. James Holland was writing the foreword for this, and James Holland was conducting research at the time, or had conducted research, and he gives this anecdote where some of the grad students he was working with were conducting research. They also worked with the participants or the students that they were doing the research with. And he said what he found, what everybody noticed, was that the people who were doing the research and working with the students, doing the research made their teaching better. And doing the teaching made their research better. We need a bi-directional relationship with the applied field and those conducting formal academic style research. We need people who work with students in classrooms, in homes, wherever you may be, to also be providing feedback and information to the researchers around what is curious to you. One way to do that is to conduct your own research, to replicate research. One of the best pieces of advice I was ever given was from Amir Stapuglia, and she, when I was trying to figure out what to do for my dissertation, she said, well, what's something you recommend all the time that if somebody said, well, why should I do that? I don't believe you, why should I do that? That you wouldn't know what research to point them to, or that you know that the research that's available is maybe not the strongest. And that was a wonderful thing, because what it did is it set me on a course to begin analyzing my own practice, analyzing what I do with students, using some of these same criteria, and then it pushed me to conduct replications and extensions of previous research on practices that I had found successful, but for which adequate research, in my personal opinion, had not yet been generated. Thank you very much. The final slides will just be my references. I greatly appreciate your attention. I hope everyone has a wonderful conference. Thank you again. This is my email address. If you would like to contact me, please feel free to do so. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.